She looked at my security badge like it had something crawling on it, tilted her head with that smug little smile, then leaned over to whisper to her Uncle Howard loud enough for half the conference room to hear. The role is replaceable. The person filling it is irrelevant. Just like that, 18 years of my work got reduced to what she called a legacy burden. I'm Rick Mendoza, 52 years old, and I'd been with Ironclad Systems since we operated out of a converted auto repair shop back in 2006. The break room still had a sign that said brake fluid storage until we finally painted over it in 2010. I didn't flinch when Brielle Ashford said those words. Not externally anyway. Internally, my gut dropped. This wasn't just another corporate meeting. This was a warning shot wrapped in designer heels and Stanford MBA arrogance. We were 3 weeks into the transition phase of a $780 million acquisition. Fortress Defense Solutions wanted to buy us, and here I was, the senior infrastructure architect who'd built every system they were trying to purchase, being measured for my corporate coffin by a 26-year-old who confused buzzwords with competence. The thing is, I'd trained her predecessor, twice. Once when he got hired, again when he came back after his fintech startup burned through $3 million in 8 months. That guy once told me, Rick, if they ever try to cut you out, they're either very stupid or already dead in the water. I thought he was being dramatic. Turns out he was being prophetic. Let me back up a bit. My story starts with 8 years in the Navy, where I learned that systems either work or people die. No middle ground. When I got out in 2006, Ironclad was just 2 guys in coveralls trying to turn an auto repair business into something bigger. They needed someone who understood networks and security. I needed a job that didn't involve getting shot at. Back then, nothing worked unless I made it work. The email server ran off a desktop computer under Jerry's desk. Our firewall was a consumer-grade router with the default password. I built everything from scratch: the network topology, security protocols, backup systems, the works. When we landed our first defense contract in 2019, I was the one who got the security clearance because I was the only one who understood what we'd built. But lately, the corporate culture had shifted. About 8 months ago, Howard brought in his niece Brielle, fresh from Stanford with an MBA and ideas about digital transformation. Internal memos started floating around with phrases like generational workforce optimization and legacy system modernization. I got pulled off 2 critical infrastructure projects and reassigned to advisory documentation, which is HR speak for sit quietly while we figure out how to replace you. Then came that Thursday morning meeting in March, supposedly a routine prep session for Fortress Defense's final due diligence review. I walked in with my transition binders, 3 of them, color-coded, with contingency, protocols for every scenario I could think of. I'd stayed late for a week straight, documenting backup procedures in plain English instead of technical jargon that would confuse the lawyers. The conference room was full of nervous energy and expensive suits. At the head of the table sat Brielle Ashford, VP of Digital Transformation, and Howard's niece. She'd joined the company 8 months ago with a LinkedIn profile that used phrases like disruptive innovation catalyst and legacy system optimization. Her main qualification was a family tree and an MBA from a school that cost more than most people's houses. I knew she'd been positioning herself for more authority, but I didn't expect her to come for my job with such calculated efficiency. She called my documentation legacy clutter, my system access outdated privilege, and my presence at buyer meetings unnecessary for modern optics. Optics. That word hit me hard, like my 18 years of keeping their lights on was just background decoration. I didn't say a word during that meeting. I didn't defend myself or argue back. I just sat there and watched her, the way you'd study a malfunction to understand why it happened. See, I wasn't shocked that it was happening. I was shocked by how poorly they were executing it. That binder on the table wasn't a prop. It contained the operational blueprint for the entire transition. Network diagrams, security protocols, vendor contacts, compliance documentation, failover procedures, everything Fortress Defense would need to verify we weren't a liability waiting to happen. And she didn't even glance at it. All she saw was my name on the cover. What she didn't realize was that the name on that binder wasn't just authorship. It was authorization, the security clearance holder, the guy who'd signed off on DoD integration protocols 8 months earlier when we started transition planning, the only person at Ironclad who could legally hand over classified system specifications to a buyer. You see, when we started preparing for this acquisition 8 months ago, I'd written the transition documentation myself. Every protocol, every contingency, every authorization sequence. And buried on page 23 of the legal framework was something I'd included for exactly this kind of situation. Clause 15.7c. All transition authority, technical oversight, and security clearance protocols remain solely with the designated transition officer listed in the pre-authorization phase. No substitutions permitted without written approval from acquiring party's security counsel. Legal had reviewed it, nodded, and copy-pasted the whole section into the final agreement with Fortress Defense. They thought it was standard boilerplate language. I knew better. Somewhere in the back of my mind, something clicked. Fine, Brielle, let's see how this plays out. But you better hope Fortress Defense never asks where the documentation really came from, because when they do, you're going to have a problem. They called me into the office on a Friday at 4:15 p.m. Nothing says corporate cowardice like a late afternoon termination with no agenda. Angela West from HR was already logged into the video call, looking like someone who'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. There was Brielle in her designer blazer, sitting next to Angela like they were about to deliver good news instead of throwing an 18-year veteran under the bus. We've been re-evaluating the strategic direction of our infrastructure transition, Brielle began, using big words like they added credibility to what was basically a family business decision. We feel that operational continuity can be maintained without redundant legacy positions. I let the silence hang there, made her uncomfortable. She was expecting me to interrupt, to ask why, to plead for clarity. Instead, I just looked at her the way I'd look at a server log full of error messages, patient, waiting to see the full scope of the problem. We appreciate your years of dedication, Rick, Angela added, avoiding eye contact like I was radioactive. This isn't performance-related. It's purely strategic streamlining. Strategic streamlining. Operational continuity. I felt like I was being fired by a business school textbook. Effective when? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Immediately, Brielle replied, folding her hands like she was chairing a board meeting instead of destroying someone's career. We'll need to deactivate your access by end of business today. I nodded once. No explosion, no threats, no passive-aggressive comments about how they'd regret this. Just a quiet exhale. Before I go, I said calmly, I'll need a complete copy of my personnel file. Access logs, security clearance documentation, project authorization forms, and any signed transition agreements. Angela blinked. That's unusual. So is terminating your security clearance holder mid-transition, I replied, still level. But here we are. They granted the request. Maybe it was guilt, maybe confusion. But 2 hours later, I had a USB drive with every document that connected me to Ironclad's systems, including the pre-signed authorization form where I was still listed as the sole transition officer for classified systems integration. The one with my signature that Fortress Defense had already reviewed and approved. I downloaded everything, backed it up, then closed my laptop. I didn't forward any files to personal accounts, didn't delete anything, didn't leave angry notes in code comments or change any passwords. I just packed my stuff. A coffee mug with the Navy anchor, a notebook with emergency vendor contacts written in my own handwriting, and those 3 transition binders nobody had bothered to review. Walking out, I passed Terry in security. Good guy, worked there for 12 years, 6 months from retirement, who nodded at me like he already knew what had happened. They let go of the wrong person, didn't they? He said quietly. I smiled. That's not for me to decide. He glanced at the binders under my arm. They asked for those back? Nope. Damn shame. As I drove out of the parking garage, my security badge slid off the dashboard and disappeared between the seats. Just a piece of plastic now, but it still had my photo, my clearance level, my digital signature embedded in every system they were trying to sell. Back inside that building, they'd just handed the keys to someone who'd need GPS to find the server room. I knew this because Austin Clark, the guy they'd tapped to replace me, had once emailed me asking how to log into the company Wi-Fi using his smartphone. He'd attached a screenshot of his phone's settings menu thinking that would help. They thought I walked away empty-handed, but I didn't need to take anything with me. Everything they needed was already documented, filed, and signed off by the one person they'd just decided wasn't worth keeping around. The weekend passed quietly. I did yard work, read a book about military strategy, ignored the occasional buzz from my phone. By Monday morning, the replacement was already in action. Austin Clark showed up for the dry run wearing sneakers. Not the professional kind. Bright orange mesh running shoes with reflective stripes, like he'd gotten lost jogging through a business district. fresh MBA from some state school, LinkedIn profile full of motivational quotes about grinding and disrupting legacy paradigms. He arrived 10 minutes late to the video call with Fortress Defense's technical team, flustered and clearly unprepared. The buyer's engineers had flown in from 3 time zones to get a detailed walkthrough of our integration protocols before their CTO signed off on the final phase. They wanted precision. They got PowerPoint karaoke from someone who said, "I think there's a process for that more times than anyone should be comfortable with." "Walk us through the classified system handover protocols," one of the Fortress engineers requested. So basically, I think there should be like an email chain somewhere. Rick probably documented it, right? Dead silence on the call. You could practically hear the red flags going up in real time. Another engineer, older guy with the patience of someone who'd seen too many acquisitions go sideways, tried to help him out. "Do you have access to Mendoza's transition documentation?" "Oh yeah, totally. I think Brielle has his old files somewhere. There were some binders or whatever." That's when I knew they were cooked. See, I wasn't on that call, but I didn't need to be. A former colleague, bless her soul, was texting me updates. "New guy is sweating bullets. Said your name 15 times in 10 minutes. Fortress team looks like they smelled something rotten." I wasn't surprised. Every transition protocol had been written from scratch, indexed, and cross-referenced, with specific authorization sequences for transferring security clearances, vendor relationships, and DoD compliance certifications. Each document required signatures from both the author and the receiving authority. Guess whose signature was on every single page of the master documentation that Fortress Defense had already reviewed and approved? Mine. And guess whose name was still listed as the authorized transition officer in their legal paperwork? Also mine. You see, here's what Brielle's strategic streamlining didn't account for. Those authorization documents weren't just paperwork. They were legal contracts with security clearance requirements. You can't just cross out one name and write in another. The DoD doesn't work that way. When Austin started floundering through technical questions he couldn't answer, panic set in. Someone must have called Brielle because she jumped on the call mid-sentence. "Everything's under control," she announced to the Fortress team. "We'll handle the details internally and follow up with comprehensive documentation." As if the Fortress team wouldn't notice that their $780 million acquisition just got handed to someone who needed help finding the server room. As if "we'll handle it internally" was going to satisfy engineers who'd spent 6 months reviewing detailed technical specifications signed by the guy they'd just fired. I was at home, feet up on the couch, drinking coffee and reading about naval strategy in the Pacific Theater. My phone was buzzing like an angry wasp, but I had it on silent. The original transition checklist sat on the table next to me, every protocol clearly documented, every contingency mapped out, my signature on every authorization page. Another text came through. Fortress asking who owns final authorization. Everyone looking at each other. Austin just said he'd need to check with his supervisor. I didn't respond. I just watched from a distance as they unraveled in real time. No sabotage needed, no whisper campaigns, just silence and the slow process of their own incompetence catching up with them. They wanted modern optics? Well, now they had them. A clueless MBA, a nervous nepotism hire with inherited authority, and transition documentation signed by the guy they'd just erased from the org chart. The clock was ticking, and my name was still the only one that mattered. James Blackstone logged into the final review call 5 minutes early. That told you everything about how serious this was. Fortress Defense's CTO wasn't some Silicon Valley stereotype with ironic t-shirts and kombucha habits. He was ex-military, gray temples, measured voice, the kind of guy who showed up early only when he was planning to end things quickly. The virtual conference room tensed the moment his name appeared. Brielle straightened her jacket and nudged Austin into position like this was some kind of corporate debate club tryout instead of the final checkpoint for a $780 million deal. Blackstone's video came online. Crisp shirt, no-nonsense demeanor, the unmistakable presence of someone who didn't suffer fools, especially not when national security contracts were involved. "Good morning," he said, nodding once. "Before we proceed, I need to confirm transition leadership. Is Mendoza on this call?" Austin blinked and looked at Brielle like a kid waiting for his mom to answer the teacher's question. Brielle cleared her throat and put on her best executive voice. "He's no longer with the company," she said flatly. No explanation, no context, just a statement dropped like it was routine personnel management instead of the demolition of a $780 million deal. Blackstone's expression didn't change for about 3 seconds. Then his eyes narrowed just slightly, the way they do when someone's about to ask a question you really don't want to answer. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "What do you mean, no longer with the company? When was this decision made?" Brielle straightened up like confidence alone could fix what was clearly about to become a problem. The role was streamlined for operational efficiency. Responsibilities have been redistributed internally. There's no disruption to continuity. That pause. That 5-second pause where Blackstone looked off camera, probably at his own team, then back at the screen. That's when the whole thing collapsed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten or lecture. He just said, "Then we're no longer interested," and closed his laptop. The call disconnected. For about 10 seconds, nobody in Ironclad's conference room moved. No typing, no shuffling papers, no nervous coughing. Just the silence of watching a $780 million deal evaporate in real time. Angela reached for her mouse like she could somehow undo what had just happened by clicking reconnect. Austin looked like someone had unplugged his brain. Brielle sat frozen with her mouth slightly open, finally understanding that the grenade she'd been juggling had just exploded in her lap. Across town, I was sitting on my back deck with a fresh cup of coffee and Thursday's newspaper. No laptop open, no Slack notifications, just me and the sound of suburban life humming along without a care in the world. My phone started buzzing, then it didn't stop. Missed calls, frantic emails, calendar invitations being modified in real time, all cascading one after another. I glanced at the screen, smiled slightly, and turned on Do Not Disturb for the rest of the day. I already knew what had happened, didn't need to hear Brielle's voice cracking through excuses, or see Angela's panicked messages, trying to figure out why their strategic streamlining had just torched the biggest deal in company history. Because I knew something none of them had bothered to learn. In deals this size, trust isn't built on presentations or buzzwords. It's built on the quiet names in the footnotes. The ones who answer the phone at 2 a.m. when a security protocol fails during a system update. The ones who've been there long enough to know where all the problems are buried. They thought they'd erased me from the equation, but my name was still on their paperwork, and now it was the only name the buyer trusted. While they stared at blank screens, wondering what had just happened, I turned the page of my newspaper and took another sip of coffee. They tried to salvage things with a follow-up call an hour later. No Blackstone this time, just some junior staff from Fortress Defense who'd been brought in too late to matter. Brielle opened with, "We believe there's been a misunderstanding," like she was explaining a billing error instead of the complete vaporization of a $780 million acquisition. Didn't matter. By lunch, Fortress Defense's legal team had sent formal notice. Due to unauthorized removal of designated transition officer and subsequent breakdown of operational trust, Fortress Defense Solutions hereby withdraws its acquisition offer. One sentence, no appeals process. By 2 p.m., Ironclad's legal team was in full crisis mode. Conference rooms full of sweating executives, Angela trying not to cry, someone from IT compliance getting yelled at for issues that had nothing to do with IT compliance. Brielle was pacing like a caged animal, trying to blame legal for not updating buyer documentation, then HR for not properly vetting the transition plan. When those explanations fell flat, she tried to loop in Howard himself, the same Howard who'd signed off on my termination with all the thought he'd give to approving office supplies. But now he looked like a man who'd just bet the company on a scratch-off lottery ticket and realized the numbers were printed upside down. Nobody could reach Blackstone. Phone calls went to voicemail. Emails bounced back with auto-replies. His assistant kept responding with variations of, "He's unavailable at this time," which in corporate speak translates to, "You're dead to us." Meanwhile, I was having lunch at a quiet cafe near the river. My phone was still buzzing in my jacket pocket, but I was halfway through a good book and wasn't about to put it down for their crisis. The door chimed behind me and someone slid into the seat across from my table. Rick Mendoza. He wasn't wearing a suit. In this business, that usually means someone important enough that they don't need to prove anything. Navy blue button-down, no tie, the kind of calm that comes from never having to bluff your way through a meeting. I set my book down and nodded. "Depends who's asking." He smiled slightly. Carlos Rivera, VP of Infrastructure at Fortress Defense. Mind if I buy you whatever you're drinking? I waved to the waitress. Make his a double espresso. He looks like he's had a long day. He laughed. Longer than you might think. We didn't talk about the deal right away. Didn't dissect what had gone wrong or why I'd been let go. Instead, we talked about system architecture, legacy database management, the weird intersection of military protocols and civilian infrastructure. 10 minutes in, he got to the point. Your documentation prevented our back-end team from approving a security vulnerability that could have compromised 3 DoD contracts, he said simply. We almost missed it. I sipped my coffee. You wouldn't have missed it. You just would have caught it 6 months too late. He nodded slowly. Our CTO doesn't want a replacement transition officer. He wants you. He leaned forward. Our CTO doesn't want a replacement transition officer. He wants you. He said, and I quote, "If Mendoza isn't on the ground, we don't land the plane." I looked at him, not surprised, just curious. And what exactly are you offering, Carlos? He smiled. A consulting contract. Fortress Defense Solutions, Principal Defense Systems Architect. Tuition $200 per hour. 40-hour minimum commitment. Full authority, no interference, no corporate politics. The waitress brought his espresso. He took a sip and winced slightly. You were right about the double. I sat back and watched as Ironclad burned itself to the ground without anyone needing to light a match. All I'd done was walk away and not come back to put out the fire. Now let me tell you about the clause that made all this possible. It was buried on page 23 of the pre-signed due diligence documentation that nobody except me had actually read word for word. I'd written it myself 8 months earlier when we started transition planning. All transition authority, technical oversight, and security clearance protocols remain solely with the designated transition officer listed in the pre-authorization phase. No substitutions permitted without written approval from acquiring party's security council. I'd slipped it in quietly, not as a trap, just as insurance against exactly what had happened. Some junior executive getting tapped to handle the most sensitive handoff in the company's history because they looked good on paper. Legal had reviewed it, nodded, and copy-pasted the whole section into the final agreement. But now that clause was radioactive. Word had spread through Ironclad that the deal hadn't just failed. It had detonated. Someone on the board, probably the audit chair who still printed his emails, had finally decided to read what they'd actually sent to Fortress Defense. That's when they found it. Clause 15.7c, Transition Authority non-transferable, Security Clearance Holder specified, one name listed, R. Mendoza. The internal scramble was apparently biblical. Legal got dragged in to explain how this had been approved. HR blamed outdated authorization matrices. The CEO stammered through a board call where someone asked, "When exactly did you realize Mendoza was indispensable?" His answer, "In retrospect." By noon, they'd brought in outside counsel. By 1 p.m., an emergency executive session was called. And by 3 p.m., someone finally worked up the courage to email me. The message came from Ironclad's legal department. "Rick, we've reviewed the transition documentation. We may have acted hastily. Would you be available to discuss your potential return?" I read it twice, then set my phone aside. Not out of anger or smugness, just clarity. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about control, like finding the steering wheel of a ship nobody had realized was drifting until you quietly took it back. I didn't gloat or post updates on LinkedIn. I just poured fresh coffee and turned my phone off for exactly 1 hour to let the silence settle. Because this was the moment they realized I hadn't been just another name on the org chart. I'd been the fail-safe. And the fail-safe still held all the keys. When I turned the phone back on, there were 17 new messages. All variations of urgent discussion needed and strategic consultation opportunity. They didn't get replies. Not yet. I was still thinking about that precise moment when all their shortcuts had collapsed under the weight of one clause, written in plain English by the guy they'd thought was replaceable. The consulting contract arrived Tuesday morning. Clean PDF, no corporate fluff, just straight terms. Fortress Defense wasn't playing games anymore. They'd seen the inside of the mess and decided to stop wasting time with diplomatic overtures. The offer was exactly what Carlos had promised. Principal Defense Systems Architect, full transition authority, no middle management, $2,200 per hour. The wire transfer for the first 40-hour block hit my account before I'd even signed. At 9 a.m., I clicked accept. By 9:30, I was logged into their secure network. By 10 a.m., Blackstone himself pinged me directly. "Welcome aboard, Mendoza. Let's get this done right. No orientation, no HR paperwork, no meetings about meetings. Just access credentials, technical specifications, and a mission. Get them to operational stability before Ironclad figured out how to tie their own shoes." The transition documentation I'd built 8 months earlier, the same files gathering dust in Ironclad's SharePoint while Austin stumbled through presentations, became the master playbook. Fortress uploaded it to their internal systems and labeled it Mendoza Protocol v2.0. By lunch, I'd identified and fixed 4 configuration errors that could have caused system failures during integration. Flagged a misaligned authentication protocol that would have locked out their entire engineering team. Sent over an annotated security audit showing exactly what Ironclad's replacement team had missed. No debates, no committee reviews, no requests for second opinions. They just implemented every recommendation immediately. And while I was systematically cleaning up the mess, Ironclad was still stepping on rakes. Brielle had been placed on administrative leave pending strategic review, which is corporate speak for "we'll decide how loud this gets before we fire you." Austin had disappeared entirely from company directories. Howard sent out a company-wide memo about leadership transitions to better align with core competencies. Translation: "We blew up the biggest deal in company history and we're still not sure how it happened." Meanwhile, Angela was suddenly very active on LinkedIn, posting inspirational quotes about resilience during challenging times. I scrolled past, without comment. None of this was personal anymore. Blackstone scheduled daily check-ins, just me and him, no bureaucracy, no performance theater. He started every call the same way. "What don't I know?" And I told him. Security gaps, compliance timing issues, vendor contracts with clauses that could explode mid-integration. We moved fast, clean, efficient. Every time I completed a milestone, every time I signed off on a protocol, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: professional respect. This wasn't some redemption story. This was just reality, realigning around competence. I hadn't failed, they had. And now I was doing what I did best, solving problems. Not for the people who discarded me, but for the ones smart enough to value expertise over politics. 6 months later, a package arrived at my house. Plain brown box, no signature required, just sitting on my front porch like any other delivery. Inside, wrapped in navy blue tissue paper, was a wooden frame. Real wood, not corporate plastic, with clean lines and careful craftsmanship. Behind the glass was my old Ironclad security badge. Not a replica, the actual badge, with the worn edges where it used to rub against my shirt pocket, the faded photo from 18 years ago when I still had more brown than gray in my hair. Underneath it, a small brass plaque. Replaceable, perhaps, but never irrelevant. I set it on the shelf in my new office at Fortress Defense, next to the framed letter from the Pentagon thanking our team for exceptional security protocol implementation. My new badge hung from the same lanyard. Principal Defense Systems Architect, gold stripe, corner office with a view. Ironclad Systems was eventually acquired by a smaller competitor for 60% less than Fortress had originally offered. Brielle had moved to a startup in Austin. Austin was selling insurance. Howard announced his retirement. I didn't follow their decline or set up Google alerts. I had systems to build, protocols to design, problems to solve. And finally, after all the corporate theater and boardroom politics, I had something that had become rare in my industry: a seat at the table on my own terms. Earned, not inherited. Respected, not tolerated. And remembered exactly when it mattered most.